Hey there, welcome to Dirt Rich, seasonal conversations on food and farming. I'm Katie Federal, the Communications Director for the Sustainable Farming Association. And today we're very lucky to have one of our Midwest Soil Health Summit presenters join us just a bit early. Sara Keough is an integrative eco-nutritionist practicing in Maryland. She specializes in clinical nutrition and regenerative agriculture to restore both human and ecological health. She's also a technical advisor with Understanding Ag. Sara will be speaking on nutrient-dense foods and human and soil health connections on March 10th at the summit. And today she's indulging me in a bit of an intro to her field of work in nutrition and regenerative agriculture that was entirely new to me, and maybe for some of you as well. Hey Sara, how's it going? Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so the first burning question, I think, is what exactly is an integrative eco-nutritionist?
Well, this is kind of a little term I coined for myself, I guess, with the inspiration of Mr. Fred Provenza. I know a lot of people are hopefully familiar with in this community for Gen Ag, but well, I'm an integrative nutritionist, clinical nutritionist. So I have a private practice here in Maryland where I work with patients with a wide variety of health issues. And but my journey actually began in my home state of Colorado, and I was working on a degree in biology. And at that time, I was actually on a career path into conservation work. So I wanted to be a conservation biologist. And of course, a big focus in that work is ecological studies. So ecological work and environmental studies, and as you know, chatted about before, geographical information systems is all important part of my coursework. And I worked in the Rocky Mountains as part of some of my internships during my undergrad program, and it was just beautiful. It was amazing being outside all the time and with nature, and just really kind of just tracking different species of birds and other wildlife, and that was all part of that sort of past life, I feel like, because it was so long ago. But I always loved nutrition and health, and that was always a passion of mine. And I kind of just felt like, towards the last year of my biology program, actually, I had this, just a change of heart. I felt I had a different calling, and I decided I wanted to pursue a graduate degree in nutrition. So it was it was hard to break away from that old that old path, though, of going into conservation work because I loved it so much. But I looked at schools all over the country, and I found this incredible graduate school in Maryland that just kind of met all my criteria of what I wanted to learn. It's part of an integrative nutrition degree. And just to kind of give your audience an understanding of of integrative health, because that's maybe a term they've heard of before, or
Mhm.
maybe not. But integrative health is where really this community of integrative medicine, I would say, is we're trying to integrate in many different modalities to help people heal. So it's not just about conventional medicine and medications. Some of those things have their place in healing and health, but obviously we're trying to get to the root cause of health conditions, and help people restore their health from the ground level up, and work on a solid foundation. So we integrate in maybe herbal remedies and natural supplements. But obviously, food is incredibly integral to that whole healing process. So that's in a nutshell what that means. And Fred became an inspiration when I heard him one day, years ago at I think it was a conference, the Grasswood Exchange. He gave a talk on nutritional wisdom of animals, and he was talking about how the doctors of the future will be ecological doctors, and that really resonated with me. And I think at that time he was talking about really farmers and ranchers, and being ecological doctors and healing the land with what they're doing with their work. But for me, it was kind of like, oh well, I think I'm an eco-nutritionist given my background and what I'm doing now.
Oh, absolutely. That reminded me of the Wendell Berry quote that you used in like a recent article for Understanding Ag, where uh,
Yeah.
people are fed by the food industry, which pays no attention to health, and are treated by the health industry, which pays no attention to food.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I heard that quote years ago too, and that one always stuck with me. And that's when I really started, um, looking into, the farming communities and learning sort of the plight of farmers, what they've been dealing with for so many decades in this country, but also our food system and why it was so broken. And Wendell Berry was very influential in my career as well. And he's an activist, he's not just a farmer, he's an activist, an incredibly beautiful poet. And so many quotes from him. There's another one I use in my talks all the time, that eating is an agricultural act. And that's so important to my work when I'm trying to teach patients, clients, what the importance is of their food choices. It's not just about their health, it's about how their food choices impact our environment, our ecological systems too, and our agricultural systems, of course.
So, at a few different places, I've seen you refer to farmers as healers. Can you
Mhm.
explain a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, and that's, again, that's kind of some of the thoughts that Fred inspired when he spoke of, ecological doctors, and it's just, and Wendell's work and many other farmers and folks that inspired me in this community of regenerative agriculture. It's farmers and ranchers, it's their obligation to be good stewards of the land and to take care of their ecosystems and to learn how to farm with nature. And so I truly believe that farmers, ranchers are going to help, heal this planet in so many ways. And I think it's always kind of funny when, patients will come to me and say, "Thank you so much. You helped me heal," or you're a healer, And I say, "Well, no, I'm really not a healer. I just help maybe facilitate your healing process, and I was here to guide you." I think it's really the farmers that they provide the nourishment, right? They're healing the land. And now we know that they can play a really significant role in climate change. We can change our agricultural practices and restore a lot of our ecosystems and sequester carbon, right, in the soil. So I have so much respect for farmers and admiration, and hope to farm someday myself. But
Oh, wow.
yeah, they really are healers.
Yeah, and your comment about, people calling you a healer and saying, "No, you're just facilitating," uh, that brought to mind a few memories of conversations I've had with growers too, and I think they might actually say the same thing in some cases of like, "I'm just facilitating, my stewardship is facilitating the healing of the land, but like nature is, as long as I'm managing it properly, nature is doing the work for me," kind of thing. Um,
Yeah. I think it's good to have
yeah.
that humility, right? I think we all kind of, I guess none of us humans really want to take credit for it. At the end of the day, it's Mother Nature that's healing us,
Yeah.
right? So,
Wow, so in your practice there, I imagine that like you may run into healthy food access as a barrier for some people in the work that you do. Um,
yeah.
and I'm yeah, curious since that's such a big issue, in all parts of the country, if food access is difficult for financial reasons or for geographical reasons. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering like what tools or systems have you found to maybe help bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's a huge problem, right? So,
Mhm.
um, where I live, I mean, just to kind of talk locally for a minute, and then to kind of expand that to what I see is can be a model for other systems throughout the country and the world. Locally here, I will say it's a different type of demographic here in Maryland. Cost of living is very high, but then you have, some inner city areas like in Baltimore. And so it's quite, a contrast. And there's a lot of places like that, I think, throughout the country. You have the cities, and then you have inner city areas and suburbs and rural communities. So, how do you get good quality food to all these different regions? And, and how do we make it affordable, right? And
Mhm.
one thing I will say, I always like to give a big shout out to my friend Liz Reitzig. She has a buying club, like this little local, kind of small regional buying club called Grassfed on the Hill. And you can find her club through 1000ecofarms.com. Excellent resource to look for these buying clubs all over the country. And what it is an online kind of buying club where there's no fee to sign up. You just go in and pick out foods from all sorts of different farmers that she's kind of vetted, to be of good quality, and people are taking good care of the land and whatnot. And you can buy all sorts of things, meats and eggs and dairy. And she does all the work, all the legwork. She goes around to Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia and all these farms once a week, every week, picks up everything for your order and then drops it off at a local drop point nearby, or you maybe have to drive 20 minutes or so to get your order. And then you pay a small delivery, fee as part of your order. And it's just a wonderful, amazing service. I've referred so many of my patients to her when they're struggling with sourcing. And I'm seeing a lot of other creative things too, there's these kind of farm to food truck operations, where they're getting into the cities and getting people fresh local food from the farms. Just tons of farmers markets too, I think are really important to have. And, here in Baltimore, there's a huge farmers market. So huge, where a lot of people can go. And then we're talking about, issues with socioeconomic factors and people that do have financial constraints. That's a big problem too. And I try to teach people how to incorporate, the most nutrient dense foods into their diet for the least, costs and, the least expensive way. And that's when you get a little creative and open your mind to introducing new things to your palate, it's kind of, there's a way to eat nutrient dense food in a way that's affordable. An example of that would be, organ meats and bones for making bone broth, that you can easily turn some of these foods that used to be like the throwaway parts, the butcher would just throw out the livers, right, or give the liver to the dogs to eat. And now people, pay for the livers because they're nutrient dense foods. Or even programs that I've seen are imperfect produce, or ugly produce, right? The produce that might have blemishes on it or have odd shapes or whatever that people just don't want to buy, and they get kind of left behind, while people still perfectly good food. And there's programs for that too. And so you can get some organic produce and much lower cost through some of those type of programs. So, it's definitely not an area that I work in, but it's something I'm always trying to learn more about, because I have to be able to help people get access to those type of foods for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like, as with most, I guess, ecological issues, we're finding that a diversity of options really
Mm-hmm.
helps. You listed a lot of a great variety of ways to get healthy food into people's hands.
Yeah, that's a good analogy there. Diversity everywhere.
Yeah.
A good thing.
And I know you're going to dive into nutrient dense foods more at the Soil Health Summit. But since you mentioned, would you mind giving us a brief background for folks who haven't heard of nutrient dense foods before?
Yeah, that's a good topic. It's one of my favorite topics, because one of the questions I always get is, what is nutrient density? What does that even really mean? And I'll definitely, of course, go into that in my talks and presentations. I like to explain to people that nutrient density, is classically defined as the, number of nutrients per calorie food. So one example I like to give people sometimes, if I have, a couple blueberries in one hand and I'm holding a couple slices of bread in the other hand, if you think about the number of calories in each food, and then if you think about the number of nutrients in each food, which one do you think has more nutrient density, which has more nutrients per calorie? And it's pretty easy, right? Most people are going to say, well, the blueberries, right? They're going to have lots of antioxidants and fiber and all these wonderful polyphenols and plant compounds. And the bread, the couple of slices of white bread is going to be very processed and, not as nutrient dense. But the conversation always gets a little more interesting if you switch that up and say, okay, let's say I have, the cup of blueberries again, and I have maybe a small serving of nutrient dense steak, some grass-fed beef from Gabe Brown's farm or whatever, and what if you compare them? Let's just say they're actually calorically equal. Let's say you have enough blueberries to equal the amount of calories in this tiny piece of steak or whatever. Which one has more nutrients? Which one's more nutrient dense? And that's where the conversation gets really interesting, because people aren't sure unless they, unless we're listening to certain narratives that keep promoting meat as not good for our health and not nutrient dense, which we could talk about. But, it turns out the pasture raised meat, especially from an operation that's, regenerative operation, has lots of nutrients, probably a lot more than the blueberries. So,
Mm.
so nutrient density is also really, at least the research around nutrient density is quite, I want to say reductionistic. There's this term of nutritional reductionism, meaning we're just looking at, most nutritional science is really flawed when it comes to looking at nutrients, because they're only looking at a small subset of nutrients, maybe 10, 15, 20 nutrients. There's one particular study I bring up a lot in my talks, and that's, it's called the Milo study. It was a French study, and they were looking at a huge variety of different foods and assessed their nutrient density, but they really only looked at maybe 15, 20 different nutrients. There's thousands of different phytochemicals, plant compounds, probably some we haven't even discovered yet, at least as far as their health benefits go, and what they can do in the human body. So that type of research is interesting, but it's still quite limited because there's so many other nutrients that we're not looking at. And I think, Dr. Fred Provenza's work, and if anyone's read his book Nourishment, it's just, it really is a masterpiece. It's an amazing book. And he talks a lot about this concept of nutrient density and all the different nutrients in a variety of foods. He's doing some work with Dr. Stefan van Vliet down at Duke University, and they're conducting some research to really assess the different phytochemicals in different foods, particularly meat. So that's through the different type of research called metabolomics, and so it dives much deeper into nutrient profiles in food. So it's kind of like, in a nutshell, the nutrient density piece, but there's so much more we need to understand, and there's a lot lacking in current research.
Yeah, that's kind of what has, at least for me, made it so complex to even approach topics of nutrition, because there's just so much to it, and every time
Yes.
you like try to grasp at one thing, you pull out another. And
Yeah.
so I want to step back to, your example between the blueberries and the bread, and then how things get, a little more complicated when we start to talk about like the blueberries and the steak. Um, so at SFA, we talk a lot about, the 5 principles of soil health. We got keeping the soil covered, minimizing soil disturbance, increasing crop diversity, keeping a living root in the soil. And then the fifth one is kind of a sticking point for some people, about integrating livestock. And so through the lens of like nutrition and health, how would you talk about how like animals fit into the picture? And hopefully speaking to, those who include both meat and animal products in your diet, and those who don't. Yeah, meat is kind of a can of worms for some people. So I'm curious
It
about that.
sure is. It
Yeah.
sure is. And it's a topic I've become so passionate about, and I didn't realize I would, because I've dabbled personally in so many different diets of vegetarianism and veganism, and then
Mhm.
paleo, and carnivore diets, kind of all over the map, dabbling in different things. But kind of going back to your example, or rather the example I brought up with the blueberries, right, and the steak. The way I try to encourage people to look at those is not that they're maybe competing with one another, that maybe they're both really nutrient dense, but in incredibly different ways. So, there's some foods that are obvious, they're going to be very, obviously going to be very poor, in nutrient density, right? Like the white bread example.
Mhm.
But other foods, I think, there's this tendency for some groups of people, or some humans, that want to have this either or mentality. We can't have the fruits and vegetables with the meat. The meat
Mhm.
has to be out of the diet. And there's just really, I would say, powerful narrative right now. A lot of organizations around the world that are really encouraging people to adopt a plant-based diet, right? Plant-based, that term has become all the rage. First it was kind of like
Mhm.
vegetarianism and veganism, but now it's like plant-based is the new catchphrase. And I would hear this sometimes, and I didn't really get too concerned about it. And then the plant-based meats became um, really popular, right? And I've written some articles about this for Understanding Ag, and we did a whole webinar on it. A lot of the health concerns that I have with the plant-based meats, and they're super incredibly processed. some with highly questionable ingredients. And, of course, that's a whole other can of worms in and of itself. But as far as incorporating meat into the diet and the critical importance of that, just from a health standpoint, when I learned about how nutrient dense, organ meats were, and even just the nutrient density of, just a steak, right? And particularly a regenerative steak,
Mhm.
um, it's just amazing how healing it is for people. And I first started learning about the carnivore diet a few years ago and how extreme that is. And you and I were just chatting about that before. Like it's basically a diet where you're just eating all animal sourced foods. So if you tolerate dairy, that can include cheeses and milk, but obviously red meats and even fish. But it's the complete elimination of all plant foods from the diet. And I thought, well, that's pretty extreme. I thought veganism was
Mhm.
extreme, but wow, that's the opposite end of the spectrum, right? As far as extremes go. And I always maintain an open mind and just, I want to learn how this is helping people, just like I wanted to learn how veganism is helping people. And it was very impressive, some of the results people would get and the stories I would hear about people healing their autoimmune conditions and their gut issues, their chronic lifelong digestive issues, and the energy they felt when they started incorporating animal proteins into their diet. And it was just fascinating to me. And again, I was very skeptical because when it comes to extreme diets, I don't like the idea of elimination of too many foods. I want to be as
Mhm.
inclusive as possible of so many foods. What did we talk about earlier? Like diversity, diversity in your diet
Yeah.
is just so important too. But sometimes I think diets that might be extreme, if they're used maybe temporarily in a very therapeutic way, that can be a way to transition into incorporating other foods into your diet. And that's what I try to do with most of my patients, really, throughout their healing journey. But I will say that I think there's something really important that we should all think about, and it's something called bio-individuality. And what that essentially means is that we're all individuals, right? We're all extremely different individuals with very different physiology and genetics and biochemistry. And we all respond to different foods differently. So I've come to the sort of conclusion at this point, and again, my mind's always open. I'm always learning, but I've come to just sort of understand that everybody is different and does performs differently in different diets, right? Some people do better with a more plant-based diet. Some people do much better with more meat-heavy diet. But by and large, I think adding animal proteins to people's diets that's where I've seen some of the most amazing health outcomes. And again, that's what I'll be talking about in more detail in our upcoming talk, my upcoming presentation rather, about the case studies, presenting actual, evidence. Like, here's the improvements I've seen in cholesterol by incorporating more meat into the diet, which
Mhm.
goes very much against like I said, that very pervasive narrative that we keep hearing about how bad meat is for our heart health and our cholesterol
Mhm.
and inflammation. I see inflammation markers go down. I see cholesterol improve when people add in animal proteins to their diet. It's amazing.
Gosh, oh, I have so many questions now, but I'll try to direct them away from, what you're gonna present on next week. But that, brings up kind of my like big question I guess I've been grappling with. There's so many mixed messages about nutrition and health. When you were just talking about plant-based, plant-based now seems like a code word for healthy. There's this like an assumption behind that without many questions. When you were talking about how cholesterol and meat been kind of demonized. I remember, a family member years ago doing like the Atkins diet, which was lots of meat, lots of cholesterol.
Yeah.
um, and so like these our perceptions or understandings of health and nutrition totally change over time with regards to like specific types of food or nutrients or ingredients.
Mhm.
And then not to mention just like different diets that pass through and whether those are healthy for us like emotionally, psychologically, or physically is kind of up for debate in some cases, I
Yeah.
think. So as eaters, what advice do you have for people who need to like navigate all these messages and sometimes like directly conflicting information?
Again, such a good question, and I get these questions directly from patients all the time. It's probably one of the first questions I get within an initial session with the patient. How do I
Mm.
navigate this very, very confusing food system? And how do I know who to believe? I have a doctor over here who's telling me plant-based is ideal, and I have another doctor over here that's been on a carnivore diet, and they're telling me this is the way to go.
Mhm.
um, and again, it kind of just goes back to that bio-individuality thing. I think we all need to just find what really works for our bodies and be willing to experiment. And um, it really does require an open mind too, and being willing to try new foods. But I feel like by and large, the patients that seem to have the most optimal health are those that do eat very seasonally and eat a huge variety of foods. And I personally found that's what works for me. So just to
Mm.
give you an example, like maybe in the wintertime, this time of year, especially where I'm at here in Maryland, there's not anything growing fresh and local. So I eat a lot more meats and I feel great with it. I eat more meat and try to eat more fish, and try to source as local as I can. I'm not 100% local, of course, but I try to get everything local and fresh, because I want also nutrient density is dependent on the freshness of the food, right? And how we process it and store it. So I want food that's as local as possible for that aspect too, the nutrient density aspect. But then, as we kind of fade into spring, transition in spring and winter, or I mean summer, right? We're gonna have more fresh food available, and so that's when I start adding in a lot more plant foods, and especially in a seasonal way. Some of the first foods that come up in the spring might be like asparagus, and I'm a wild mushroom forager, so I love eating wild mushrooms that come up, as morels will be here in hopefully a month or two. And so I really love that idea of seasonality. And then maybe, in the summertime, maybe I might cut back a little more on the meats and have a more, you know, maybe plant-based kind of approach to my diet. I do eat animal proteins all year round though, and my diet is never really devoid of that. I maybe just eat a little bit less at certain times of the year. So then the cycle might repeat itself. And once you go into the fall, start adding more squash and kind of carbohydrate rich foods. And then again, winter kind of go into more of a carnivore thing. And that's something I've been playing around with more recently. And I think that works really well. And one of my mentors in my graduate school program, in my nutrition program, said that, and it always really stuck with me. And he didn't really, as far as I know, he never talked about, agriculture, certainly not regenerative agriculture and nutrient density. But he did say that he saw that patients that had that flexibility and open-mindedness and always willing to try new things and eating with the seasons just had the best health outcomes. And
Wow.
you're also maximizing the variety of nutrients you're getting. You're making your microbiome really happy with all these different foods. And so, yeah, I think it's just trying different things is the best advice I can give people. Is just try different things and be willing to open your mind and read the research, and hopefully, like, with me presenting case studies, and it's not just the results I'm getting with patients, other practitioners are also getting these results that when we add back in animal foods to the diet, we just see such an improvement in health. And, I always just like to point out one really obvious fact that many people don't know, or they maybe forget. Humans have been eating animal meats for millions of years, you know, millions of years. And I don't know how we would have survived as a species, if it was something that was so damaging to our health. So,
Mm. Gosh, I've never heard like the seasonal eating has always been under the context of like reducing your carbon footprint, supporting local farmers, like all great things. But that's new to me to hear it in the context of like, oh, this could actually be, beneficial for your health and body. Um,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
fascinating, and it was bringing to mind regenerative practices, stemming from indigenous practices, native
Mm,
practices, and in theory, they
mhm.
ate, seasonally, of course. That was what was available. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's I don't know if you have any comments to make about that or knowledge. This is musings and me making connections now, but
Yeah, no, and I think that's yeah, if we that's actually I'm really glad you brought that up as a matter of fact, because I think that's the other component of this all. If we try to think back to our own ancestry and how did your ancestors eat? Where did you come from? You know, and I have a lot of Eastern European, particularly Hungarian in my background. So obviously they quite different from some of my other ancestors, which are from Ireland. Some
Hmm.
similarities, but still very different. And then my great grandfather was Native American, so then there's a different different patterns of eating. So it just it depends on your I think your ancestry too. Really look into your ancestry, and that's something I've tried to do more so for myself recently too, is understand my genetics and my
Mm.
ancestry, because I think there's a lot to be said about trying to eat the way your ancestors ate, not just the one size fits all kind of paleo diet, right? Which I think the paleo diet's really been helpful for a lot of people. But I think to dive even deeper in that, take that to the next level, exploring what your ancestors really ate, um, is so important. My partner, he's Indian, of Indian descent, so he's Indo-Asian, and we're kind of discovering that, what, I think you just need more rice in your diet. Because when we first met,
Oh,
he kind of cut a lot of grains out of his diet, and he felt really great and improved his joint pain. And, he lost a little weight. He was never really overweight to begin with, but he's one of those people that can eat just so much food and never gain weight, right?
oh, the
One of those that
dream.
most,
Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
exactly, that most everyone's jealous of.
Yeah.
And so perfect metabolism. But, he's like, trying to put some muscle mass on, and, just very lean body composition. But I say, what, I think you just need a little more rice. Think about your ancestry. And we actually just had a meal the other night, with the wonderful Ray Archuleta when we were on his farm. And, we added a lot more rice back in his diet. And he was like, I felt good with that meal, like having more rice. It
Mm.
felt more satiating rather than just eating meat, or meat and vegetables type of thing. So, so that's just, again, think back to your ancestry and embrace that more and incorporate that into your diet. And in indigenous cultures, I think it's just so wonderful to learn from them and their traditional ways of eating and even preparing food, to maximize nutrient density in food is interesting to learn about.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Could you say a little bit more on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, I've learned that, well, over the years, I've learned that the preparation of grains, for example, and beans and legumes, there's ways to soak them and ferment them, fermenting vegetables, of course. One of my favorite ferments is kimchi. That's a
Mm.
very traditional fermented Korean dish, and it's just fermented cabbage, and you can put a variety of different vegetables in it, but typically it's cabbage and maybe some carrots and things like that. And very spicy, they use a lot of peppers in there. And I love kimchi, and fermented sauerkraut would be something maybe more from my ancestry. Um, so, I think learning how to prepare foods to maximize the digestibility of it and the nutrient density. And, there's even like fermented meats, which I don't know a lot about, but I'm kind of learning more about this. If you think about the beef sticks that a lot of farmers use, there's and maybe you might know more about this.
Oh.
This is where I need to pick a farmer's brain. But there's a species of bacteria that they'll use to kind of preserve, these meat sticks that you see, and that's
Oh.
actually a source of like a probiotic. Come to find out, so I just recently learned
Wow.
that from another practitioner. I said never really thought about that. But yeah, you can even ferment different meats and to make them more, again, to make the nutrients in the food more bioavailable. And that's actually something I didn't comment about previously when we were talking about the nutrient density of animal proteins. One really important consideration for consumers is that the nutrients in animal proteins, animal fats, animal meats, and dairy is tends to be a lot more bioavailable, meaning our body can absorb and assimilate and utilize those nutrients much more easily than it can from plant foods. And that is
Mm.
because some of the plant foods have, phytic acid, phytates, lectins, these plant compounds that kind of bind to minerals or impede the absorption of certain nutrients. So that's why I think some of these people do better too on carnivore diets, right? Because these nutrients are more bioavailable. If you have impaired digestion, you're not struggling with breaking down all these fiber-rich foods just to even allow your body to access the nutrients. So anyway, it's all so fascinating, again, learning about all these different ways to prepare food um, before we even consume it, so that we can allow for greater bioavailability in the nutrients.
Man, I don't even know where to go from there. That's so that's all
I know. I was like,
so
I feel
new
like I
and
went on
so
a
interesting.
tangent, but
No, it's oh my gosh. It's just making me realize, I guess, how much more there is to something that I already was overwhelmed by,
yeah.
nutrition just having so much to it. Um,
Yes, yes.
Gosh, I guess I want to backtrack just slightly. When you're talking about bio-individuality, how if seeing a nutritionist isn't accessible for some folks, like how can we explore that individually? You mentioned we were talking about eating seasonally could be a way to see how you feel, but do you have more specifics on our other ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, obviously, finding out what really grows local for you, and when it comes into season is important, but doing some investigative work into your ancestry, maybe going and running some genetic testing. It's relatively inexpensive, and you can get your complete genomic profile essentially and plug that into different software programs and even learn about where based on your genetics, where you might be more predisposed to, for example, insulin resistance or heart disease. So insulin resistance, diabetes, a lot of these chronic conditions we hear a lot about. Some people are just more genetically predisposed to them. So that can guide you in some of your eating patterns if you know that information. Um, and, there's also certain genes that even can control how well we metabolize and utilize certain nutrients. So for example, I have like a genetic defect where my body has a greater need for zinc. And there is micronutrient testing that I utilize in my practice. And I think that's a really critically important test to evaluate nutrient deficiencies, with some common vitamins and minerals. And whenever I test on that, for myself, anyways, whenever I test my micronutrient test, I tend to be deficient in zinc. And I have felt so much better with zinc as far as, mood and, depression, anxiety, because zinc is incredibly important as in to helping us make neurotransmitters, like serotonin, dopamine, and, zinc gets a lot of attention for being an important mineral for our immune system, but zinc
Mhm.
has over 300 different, is involved in over 300 different metabolic processes in the human body. So that's just one nutrient, right? So you can
Yeah.
look at different genes for, even vitamin D. So that can kind of give you a little guidance, as far as kind of custom tailoring a diet to your specific biochemistry. And sometimes you just don't know until you actually try things, and I would say give it at least, a good month or two with changing your eating patterns. Don't stick with it for, a few days or a week before you kind of make up your mind if it's right for you, because sometimes it really takes time for your body to adjust to different things. Obviously, if you feel really unwell right off the bat, it's probably not going in a good direction, but
Mm.
sometimes it takes a little time for your microbiome as well, especially the gut microbiome, to get used to adding in new foods. So, and particularly with different plant foods, right? Some people experience maybe bloating and gas when they add in some different foods that their microbiome is not used to, but that doesn't mean your microbiome can't adjust to those different foods, especially when you're trying to incorporate in new foods. Generally, it's not a problem with, animal-based foods, though, unless it's like a dairy sensitivity or something like that, or some people are reactive to eggs. But most people tolerate most meats very well, whether it's beef or lamb or goat or pork. And I love all those meats. I eat all of them, and a variety of fish. So yeah, I think just tinkering around with different things. There's, even for myself, all the time, I'm always questioning, what's really ideal, and that's why I like the idea of eating very different throughout the year, so that I'm just
Mm.
getting a variety of foods.
And I love that method, figuring out what's available locally at different times of year, going to farmers markets can have that built-in component then of like building connections with people who grow the food,
Yeah.
connecting with farmers in your local food system. And that, I mean, I totally understand how like changing your health and nutrition can be life-changing. And of course,
Hmm.
adding people to your circle and forming these great relationships can be
Yes.
life-changing as well. It's
Yeah.
love
That's
it.
I no, I love actually was gonna say I love that you brought that up because that's something I always try to emphasize to people as well, whether I'm
Mm,
speaking in at conferences or whether I'm talking one-on-one to a patient, is to really cultivate that relationship with your local farmers and develop that relationship and ask them what they're doing with their soil and you know, um, maybe pick their brain about what they know about the nutrient density of some of their foods. And that's where I hope to educate farmers because some of them don't know about how wonderfully nutrient dense the foods are they're growing and how they can speak to that when they're talking to their consumers customers that are at the farmers market and asking them questions about what they're growing so that's all part of the just that beautiful circle, connecting it all together of getting to know your farmer, getting to know where your food comes from. I love it when farmers are just, welcoming and have people come to the farm, maybe having a farm
mhm.
day a couple times a year. We have people come out to the farm and see what you're doing. Or, Gabe says, and much like Joel Saladin, my farm's open 365 days a year, anytime. You can just come out to the farm and see what's going on. But yeah, having that connection between consumers and farmers is so important. So yeah, going to the market, seeing what's seasonal, and actually talking to your farmers and having conversations really important.
Absolutely. And for those who, are nervous maybe about asking questions like that, in my experience, and I'm sure yours too, the farmers are so excited to talk about,
Yeah,
get into specifics. And I know some people really pride themselves on, growing food for their community. And
yeah,
they would love to have that conversation with you. They'd
that's
love to know what you're
true.
cooking. And yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know, like, farmers, if they feel like that's maybe lacking from that experience. I'd be curious to know
Mm.
from their perspective. But from the consumer perspective, I feel like yeah, some uh, a lot of people maybe just go to the market and get what they need and maybe say hello and have their pleasantries with the farmer, but are they really asking important questions about how they're growing their food, or how's this crop doing this year, what's going on with the soil, how are your animals doing, and could I come to
Hmm.
the farm and have some more of those questions that um, yeah, cultivate that relationship. But yeah, I think that the farmers that are, that's been my experience. What similar to what you just said, Katie, about farmers that are proud of their work and they're excited to talk about it. They welcome those questions,
Hmm.
and I've kind of had to, gently um, correct some patients because on how they approach some farmers, right? Because you don't want to put farmers on the defense and come at them
Right.
with questions like, are you using chemicals, and you know are
Oh
you
yeah.
100% organic? And we kind of have to be gentle with how we approach it with different farmers, because some are in a transition process, and maybe some do use chemicals from time to time, and maybe some don't use any chemicals, but they're not organic certified, because it's very
Hmm.
expensive for some farmers, for some smaller operations. So I always try to remind people, don't turn your nose up at people that you think aren't doing everything perfect to your standards. Learn about maybe what they're doing, and ask questions and engage them in conversation, because I do think you're right. I think farmers want that relationship, and they enjoy that part of being at the market.
Hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. That has come up in conversations, where it's mostly farmers too, is how do we show the value of the work we're doing, and the behind the scenes work too of like this is the care that I take to make sure that this crop grows well without chemicals, or I used a cover crop to kind of amplify this aspect. And this is an interesting conversation for I think all parties involved.
Right. And that's where I think the movie like Biggest Little Farm really has been so profound, which I'm sure you've seen, to kind of
Yeah.
give people, give just the average consumer insight into all the struggles that farmers really go through, especially if you're trying to maintain an operation that's a regenerative one, that's farming with nature. All the different things all the, you know, predators that they had to deal with on their farm in that movie, and all the obstacles, that would pop up, and they had to learn how to use nature to counteract those things. And those are just, you don't see that when you're at the market just buying your food. It may not even come up in conversation, but seeing that movie gives people, it's so powerful for giving people that perspective, and then a new respect for farmers and what they endure. But yeah, I think that's where going to the farm is also really important. I love when farmers have it, at least one day a year. If you make time for like a farm day,
Mhm.
get the customers to come out to the farm. People love that, and they love bringing their families. And I think that's just always, those are always really cool events.
Well, we've strayed like almost completely into like the eater or consumer side of things by this point. But I know that, I mean, we're going to have a lot of farmers at the session for the Midwest Soil Health Summit. And it'll be, of course, eaters of all kinds. Anyone who's interested, this will be accessible and interesting to you as well. But Sarah, would you like to give a little preview, I guess, of what your summit presentation will be?
Yeah, so I'm definitely going to discuss more of like the concepts around nutrient density that we talked about today, and present some very cool studies on at least what we do know right now about nutrient dense foods. And I really like to shine always, really bright light on Fred Provenza. And, like I mentioned before, Dr. Stefan Van Vliet and the research they're doing, because I just truly think they're like the heroes for the regenerative farmers right now, with the research that they're putting out there to back up that what farmers are doing with their soil, and the holistic managed grazing of livestock, the integration of livestock on the land, and also how that plays a role in the ecological health. What the research is showing is that is, in the end, all of that is producing nutrient dense food. And so I like to just kind of talk a little bit about that, and how that's all connected to our health in so many ways, from our microbiome health, and obviously giving us the nutrients that our body needs for a really well-functioning immune system. Of course, over the past year, a big concern for a lot of people is keeping their immune systems really strong and really healthy, with everything that's going on with the virus. So we that's at the end of the day, you just want to, no matter how you decide to manage your health with pharmaceuticals or not, at the end of the day, you still have to eat well, and do all those other lifestyle things of sleep and exercise and drinking plenty of water to maintain a good foundation for your health. But I think to dig into that deeper and just kind of take it to the next level, learning how nutrient dense food is actually impacting your immune system is critically important. So that's just something I talk about all the time with my patients. So I'll be discussing that and presenting some really neat case studies. I just started doing that with this, most recent presentation I gave. So I'm going to add in a lot more, hopefully, for this one, and talk about, real life examples of people that switch their diet to that of one that is better food quality. It's very difficult to be totally regenerative, right? But at least if you're sourcing some regenerative meats and trying to source some local produce from healthy soils from a farmer you trust, that's a huge step in the right direction. And I see just awesome changes with just that alone, even before we even get through the whole process of all the other stuff I do within functional integrative medicine, such as testing for food sensitivities, and looking at your hormonal balancing, or actually doing a stool test to look at what's happening with the microbiome. Before I even have to like dig into any of those kind of what we call functional medicine tests, and all those things in that toolbox, I see great changes with just changing the diet and improving food quality and incorporating in more animal proteins. So that's kind of the case studies I'll be presenting, and even before and after results. Like, here was this person's cholesterol before, and here's what it looks like now, and how wonderfully improved it is after adding more animal proteins and saturated fat and all these things we keep hearing are bad for us and causing inflammation in our body. Well, it's not true. I see inflammation markers go down and cholesterol improve and all that, like I mentioned. So it's just awesome to, I think, see real life examples of that. So I'll present some of those case studies, and any other interesting things I'm always discovering. I'll probably throw in the presentation at the last minute, because I'm always between these two worlds of again, integrative medicine and regenerative agriculture. And it's hard keeping up with these two fields. There's like, my brain wants to explode every day because it's so much that it's like, oh man, I can't keep up with it, but I do my best to stay on top of all the latest research in each of those areas. And so I'm in these two different worlds all the time, which is fun because I never get bored, but it's a lot to take in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for your work, because either topic is, a series of topics within itself. And I can imagine that keeping on top of both of them for all the latest things is just nuts. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's crazy. Even with just the world in the microbiome research alone, there's just so many crazy amount of studies coming out every day. And I'm like, oh man, I need the Cliff Notes version of all this to stay on top of it. But it's fun. Like I said, I never get bored, but I'm always trying to stay balanced between both worlds and just connect it all together. Because at the end of the day, my big mission is to just unite the consumers, the agricultural communities, and our healthcare practitioners. And that's a whole other topic, I'm sure, for another podcast, another day. But getting our healthcare practitioners on board with understanding all of this is essential. Yeah, I definitely can't do it alone. I need help from all my peers and colleagues to really educate consumers and their patients about all this as well. So,
gosh, yeah, it is also interconnected here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're really looking forward to having you. And for our listeners, that's going to be on March 10th. The summit runs March 9th through 11th. You can register for the whole thing. We'll put a link in the show notes to do that. And then you can catch more of what Sara's got to share with us, because as she just said, it's a whole lot and it's all really important. So cool. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sara. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Katie. I really appreciate being here, and I hope to see all of you next week.
Dirt Rich is produced by the Sustainable Farming Association. We believe that agriculture, done well, heals. For more resources or to tap into the Farmer to Farmer Network, visit us at sfa-mn.org.